Welcome to Positive Perspectives, a podcast dedicated to sharing powerful stories that present opportunities to grow from lived experiences. In each episode, we speak to expert guests who bring thought provoking topics, meaningful lessons, or stories that spark transformation and deeper understanding. Today, I'm joined by Jackee Holder, a journal keeper, urban walker, writer, coach, facilitator, co founder of the School of Journaling and the Tuesday Mornings Women Co writing space. She also pens a monthly Right Now column in the Psychologies magazine. Jackee promotes psychological and emotional well-being, advocating and championing the therapeutic benefits of journaling as a self-directed well-being practice. It's actually inspired by nature, trees, and working outside. Hi, Jackee. Welcome to Positive Perspectives.
Oh, good morning, Marie, and thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm really looking forward to what's going to come out of this conversation with you.
Thank you, Jackee. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself and what you're going to be sharing with us today?
Yeah, so on my day-to-day work, I work as a coach. I work corporately as a coach. What that actually means is that I work on a range of different leadership programs, doing coach facilitation with leaders, emerging leaders, senior leaders, both in the kind of private sector. So in financial services, for example, we work along a load of programs in those services and sectors. But I also do a lot of work in the NHS, which is a real privilege for me, particularly coming out of COVID-19 and the support that was needed in that sector. So really supporting healthcare professionals in their leadership, their growth, their development. So as well as the coach facilitation, we also do individual coaching. And that's what I trained as a coach over 25 years ago. But I also, alongside all of that, I really am an advocate and a champion of journaling and reflective writing. My background is from youth and community work in the 1980s. And I was very, very privileged to be introduced to reflective practice as one of the kind of foundations of being a really good practitioner in youth and community work. So we were hosting groups. I was, holding spaces for women, for young men. We were doing a range of different creative projects, and we were always encouraged as practitioners to reflect on our work in action. So we wouldn't just rock up and run a group. We would reflect before, we would reflect afterwards. And in fact, it was in youth and community work that I was first introduced to reflective practice through my own coach. So that was my sort of first beginnings. And I went from there into the world of learning and development. And that's really where I felt really, I was just put into this space where I was able to support organizations, groups. I worked in a women's unit in a local authority. I was a training and development officer. So I just had this mandate to grow and develop women in the organization. And that's exactly what I did. And a huge part of that was around empowering individuals, empowering groups, empowering teams. And there from there, that was really where I got the thirst and the hunger to do something different, to take the experience that I was having and put it into something that channeled, doing more individual work with individuals. And that's where I started to inquire and explore training as a coach. And that was where I really began through my own personal kind of interest and discovery. And then I went into training professionally as a coach in around 2006.
So there's a real personal journey through careers and supporting others in terms of reflective writing, taking you along that journey and helping you to discover the areas that work best for you and how those areas impacted positively on the people you were working with.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it would be fair to say you described me at the beginning as a journal keeper. I've been keeping a journal since as far back as I can remember. I was that kind of child, always had pen and paper to hand. I remember going to church with my mum and dad as a young child, and I would be sitting in the very long church service on Sunday afternoons, sort of scribbling in my dad's Bible and writing up little stories as I sat there. And what I've realized is that I just had this love of words and writing and creating, and I would just use any opportunity I could find to kind of express myself. But then in my childhood, I had some very traumatic experiences, which unfortunately I didn't have anyone that I could talk to about those experiences. I didn't realize at the time was my love of reading and my love of words was a way that I was able to soothe a little bit my nervous system.
Yeah.
And, I could find myself in stories. I would particularly find myself in stories where, you know, the uh, the character had to overcome something difficult. So whether it was, back then I did read the likes of Enid Blyton, the famous five would always find some challenge that they could overcome together as a group. I was always looking for that, some hope, some way of coming through. And then when I got to my teenage years, I realized that going through, there's lots of difficulties and challenges at college, but I was also, I loved learning. And so writing was something that I used a lot. So, when there were difficult things, I knew that I could turn to my notebook and just write a few things down.
Yeah.
But I think when I got to university, all of that went. I had 3 years when I honestly could say, I don't think I kept a journal. I literally felt that university life, the academia kind of, I felt very overwhelmed with it all. And I felt very disconnected from myself. So when I came out of university and I got my first job very quickly in youth and community work, it was like this whole world opened up to me.
Mm.
And there was so much inside of me that I was somebody who was really able to express my feelings and emotions on the page. And I felt like I really reconnected to my journal writing. And I remember I got involved in something called the reevaluation of co-counseling in the 1980s. And I traveled to a lot of their conferences and programs in the United States. And I remember just that we had this conference once in Leeds, and I went there. And from the moment I arrived at this big house, it was this big mansion house. It was really, we had really heavy snowfall. And the moment I got there, Marie, I just started writing poems. From the moment we started, I was like, I just had all of this emotion that flooded out of me. And I expressed it through poetry. And they were so kind to me. Every time they had a bit of space on the program, they say to me, Jackee, do you want to read a poem? And I would just like share all of this emotion. And I realized that my journal, I was expressing myself through poetry. Poetry was a way that I found that I could talk about some of my experiences in a way that it wasn't confrontational. It was creative, it was healing, it was reflective, and it was like I was making sense
Mm.
of what I had experienced and what I had gone through. And that was a real moment of transformation. And it was not surprising because I really remember that space because not only was it a very cold day, it was also a day that the whole of the landscape was covered with snow. It was the winter,
Mm.
and the winter is typically a time when we slow down, we step back, and we reflect. It was very seasonal. And I remember going out onto the grounds and walking, and how relaxing and grounding and soothing that felt. And it reminded me back to my childhood when during the summer holidays, I would As soon as my chores were done at home, there was a little gap in our garden, and I would escape back into the back of our house where we backed onto acres of green space I lived in a place called West Norwood. It's a suburb in South London. And I would spend the whole day in nature with my satchel, with my books and my pens, with myself. And that was very soothing for me as a child. I couldn't quite name it.
Yeah.
I just did it. And I think that's been a thread that has followed through to my adulthood when I reconnected with nature very, very profoundly in my mid-30s when I started to visit that one tree.
So much in what you're saying has ignited thoughts and reflections in myself, and how words play, for me at certain points, play very, the way I use words, the way I articulate words, or how I write down words, because sometimes I will go through more sporadic journaling, which is an interesting case in itself. But when you were talking about university and that whole system of being overwhelmed by a structure, and then coming out of that and then reconnecting with your writing, is there anything that you can tell our listeners about what they can do when they're in that space of overwhelm and almost like static? How
Yeah,
can they even, because sometimes we go through seasons and periods where we don't write as much, say,
yeah,
but what can we do even just to support ourselves in that time before we can reconnect?
yeah. That's a really great question. Thank you for asking it. Um, but there's a word that has kind of really jumped out at what you just shared, and that was the word static. And that's one of the things that I really, it's a word that I really associate with university. I felt very static sitting there in the seminars and the lectures. It was like the content wasn't stimulating my creativity and other sides of my brain. It was very left brain. You go to the lecture, you go to the seminar, you have a particular school of thought. They weren't asking me questions that were stimulating my thinking and being, exploring the world in a creative way and not in a linear way. And the thing that really got me going, and something I would invite your listeners to really think about, is I found that the difference for me was being out in nature and walking. Like going for a walk, it's almost like it lubricates my thinking. Being out in nature, being able to allow my brain and my mind to kind of quieten down. That's the thing for me when I go for a walk, is that I find that my mind relaxes and it starts to observe and to see the things around me in a way that it's almost like all of these kind of brain cells start to kind of connect with each other. And I start to experience and think about things in a different way. And so what I found when I started visiting that one tree every morning was that I would always have my notebook with me, because I found that when I walked, and this is one of the things around research shows around walking, is that it really helps your creative thinking. People who go on walks come back to their offices, their desks, and they have much more capacity for thinking more creatively, more dynamically, coming up with ideas, coming up with solutions. So I found that the walk was a really good prerequisite to go into my journal, because all of these thoughts would the walk would be like a catalyst for my thinking, that I could not wait to get to the page. So this idea of stepping away from your desk, stepping away from the screen, Whether it is you walk down or cross the room to your kitchen, or as some of my clients have done, I've literally been coaching them on Zoom and I've said to them, step away and just go and look outside your kitchen window. Yeah, look into your garden. I remember one client, she looked out into her garden, and we were in the middle of a coaching session. She was talking about the complexity of her work, and you know she was really in a place of overwhelm. So I said to her, what's in the room what's inside your room? She's describing some of the things inside her room. And I said, just go and look outside the window and describe what you see out there. And then she did that. And she described her garden. She described a particular plant that was struggling. And we use that metaphor of the plant to explore how the plant was similar to her, how she was feeling about herself. And from that transpired an ongoing relationship every coaching session, where she would describe what state or condition the plant was in. And then she would describe her own condition. How was she doing? How rooted did she feel? How grounded did she feel? Where was she blossoming? Where was she flourishing? So this idea of stepping outside or using nature as a mirror, I find particularly when I'm working with leaders, is really, really helpful, because so often we're just so full on with our work. And we need to find a space where we can create a different kind of thinking space that is away from the screen. And whether somebody can actually physically step outside, or whether they can go to their window, or they can do something like, do you remember the weather report we did on the session that I did with the Diverse Coaches Network, where I found this is probably one of the best exercises that I invite leaders to engage in, which is where you you go to a blank page in a notebook, and you simply, wherever you are, you think about the weather over the last 24 hours. And you think about, how would you describe the weather during that last 24 hours? So right now, if I'm looking outside, I'm up in my office, I'm at the top of the house, I can see the tops of the trees, I can see lots of different colors: burnt orange, copper, lime green of the leaves of the trees. I can also see that the sky is a very dull, dank, greyish blue, with very little other colours in it. And that way I'm literally using all of my senses to really describe how I am seeing the weather outside of my window, or my experience of being in the weather. And that's one of the things I noticed about walking, Marie, is I would often walk through different weather format. Or, I would go out in sunshine, and then I would meet rain, and then I would meet wind, all in the space of one walk. And so what that does is it really helps you to get present, to take yourself into a much more mindful state. And that is something we are constantly getting our clients to do as coaches, to come into, to be in the conversation with you as a coach in a more mindful state. And that's what I've realized, that journaling and reflective writing is a way that our clients can do this for themselves. So they'll start with that external view of the weather, and I really kind of talk it up. I really say to people, make up the colors that you see outside. Describe what those smells might be in the air around you. One morning I went out my front door the other day, and I just had this like strong smell of moss from it had rained about 20 minutes before, and it's like all of the greenery on the pavements and the trees and the hedges on the street, everything was just like, rainwater really intensifies smells around us. There's something called petrichor of the kind of smells that are kind of um created from rainfall. And that's very, very soothing and very healing to our nervous system. And I was very, very struck by that. So that's where you might start. You describe the weather, and that doesn't need to take anything more than 2 to 3 minutes. And then I would invite your listeners to turn their gaze inwards. So they describe the weather outside. They've had a bit of fun with that, I hope. Now, how would you describe your internal weather forecast? Is it cloudy? Is it rainy? Is it sunny? Is it calm? You know, is it turbulent? Why is it turbulent? Where is it feeling turbulent? How has this turbulence come about? What are you noticing about your current state? And what I found is that that is such a it's less confrontational for most people. People feel relaxed in responding to their emotions and their feelings through the lens of nature. We talk about in the field of outdoors, coaching outdoors, we talk about nature as our co-partner. And that's how I have very rarely found a coaching client or anyone actually who is resistant to talking about themselves through the lens of nature, using nature as a way into exploring how we feel, exploring an experience, or for talking about an emotion. And then what we would do after that, then once you're listeners have done both the external and the internal, and they can list words. They don't have to write a narrative. I know some people can feel like, if you're writing a narrative, you've got to be good on prose. You've got to think about spelling and punctuation. You don't have to worry about any of that. You can give yourself permission to just write whatever comes in whatever form. And then you will do what we call a reflection write. This comes from the work of Kate Adams and Deborah Ross. And it's a practice that is integral to my work. It's something I was doing before, but I didn't have a name for it. And it's where it's almost a way of your journaling and your reflecting writing, not just being about rumination, not just about being dumping words on a page. So you do the reflection right and you read back over what you've written. And you ask yourself, what am I noticing? What am I observing? What am I aware of? What's surprising me? What's come out of the writing that I didn't realize was there? What do I want to think about more? What do I want to write about more? What do I need to speak to my coach about more? What have I missed about myself? What do I need to acknowledge or affirm myself about? So now you've got this rich questions, insights, a way of unpacking what you've written and seeing what's there that's useful or valuable for you to engage with.
Yeah. And I do remember the exercise that you delivered with us in the group that really brought in thoughts that I didn't even think were there at that point, and didn't understand that I was feeling because when I was going through the exercise, it was quite surface. And being a coach, you kind of think, well, this is gone this. Yeah, yeah, we can do this and
Yeah.
all the rest of it. And then you realize that, yeah, oh, this is going a bit deeper than I expected. And really, what is that I'm really feeling? What is the underlying emotions that are going on here, and why am I feeling them? And that's quite interesting. And that's something to explore, as you were saying with coaches. I really enjoy the layers of when you were talking about how you use nature, how you use the tool of reflective writing, how you use journaling, how you could brainstorm and it doesn't have to be all about the narrative that you put down, and all of those layers, how the simplicity of it all, really, and how quickly you can get quite deep. But I was quite interested to think we've been talking about the reflective writing, expressive writing, and I was going to ask you, why do you think that it's more necessary today to reflective write, to write expressively, to journal than ever before?
So first of all, could I just say something around what you said about your experience where you connected with those thoughts that you didn't know was there? To me, that's the magic of it. Because what reflective writing and journal writing does is it gives you that it gives you a pathway to connect with your subconscious. And we know that there is so much in the subconscious that is actually driving our behavior, our thinking, and our actions. But it's also a place of like the gold in terms of our ideas and our creativity and our intelligence. And so I often think of the image of the iceberg. And what the journal writing and the reflective writing is getting to, it's pulling out what is underneath the surface, where in these modern times, we are literally working on autopilot. In the rise of AI is doing that, it's using and doing the thinking for us. And it's taking us away from this rich, fertile territory that exists in the subconscious that we as humans, we need to engage with. Because, we need to understand our shadow in order to understand our light. And AI cannot do that work for us. In fact, the more we rely on AI, and please, I hope your listeners um, don't take this wrongly. I do feel like there is a place for AI, but if it's going to do predominantly the majority of our thinking, well, then we are on a very slippery slope, because there is something called cognitive atrophy where our brain cells, we stop using our brain cells, they start to die off if we give over our thinking, or when we give over our thinking to AI, and we don't do that work for ourselves. AI needs human intelligence. Our human intelligence is what is making AI smart, clever, knowledgeable, coming up with it's so seductive with what it can kind of give back to it. But we have to be very skillful in really protecting our human intelligence, because the vastness of our creative intelligence is our superpower. It is what is going to distinctively make us different to AI. And I feel and I know that in our current climate, first of all, journaling and reflective writing, and sorry, the body of work which under this all comes under, Marie, is what you call expressive writing. That is where the evidence base and the majority of the research is actually based. So we've got over 30 years of evidence-based research around the benefits of expressive writing. We've got pioneers like Dr. James Pennebaker from the University of Texas. That work is primarily around writing about trauma, around difficult emotions. They've had some seminal studies around that, where people have written, the people involved in the research have written for 15 to 20 minutes for 3 to 4 consecutive days about a difficult, challenging, or traumatic experience. And what they found was there's just a host of psychological, physical, and mental health benefits of them writing about those difficult experiences in a way that most people tend to push back from writing about a difficult emotion, because we think that, one of the typical things I hear around journaling is, oh, I don't want to deal with difficult stuff in my journal. I'd rather forget about it. But what we know is when that writing is done in a container, there is a structure to it, there is a border to it, that there are huge benefits. For example, some of the students that have been involved in some of the longer term studies, better grades, less visits to their doctors, describe themselves as initially not feeling great after writing about it, but 6 weeks later, improved self-confidence, self-esteem, well-being. They also have included executives in some of this research who have reported similar things, but also there have been huge benefits in terms of people's physical symptoms, improved immune systems. Again, less visits, fewer visits to their doctors. And we can combine all of this with some of the research that is the ongoing research around the impact of nature, which what I found is really interesting, really runs alongside the same benefits of writing in your journal. So isn't that interesting that the walking and the journaling hosts very similar benefits? So I was listening to some of your previous podcast hosts, and I think you had Dr. Sandy Branote, is it? On your show. And she said that globally, 1 in 2 people will be impacted by mental health globally. She didn't say nationally in the UK, she said globally. And so this year we founded the School of Journaling. I co-founded it with my co-founder, Fiona Parisher. And one of the things that we are on a mission to do is to make journaling a practice that everybody has access to, because we believe that it is a mental health skill. It is a way that people can take ownership and have agency around their own mental health and well-being. We're not saying that this is something that you do and you don't go to therapy, you don't have a community, you don't have that professional input. We're saying that it needs to be a foundational practice. But the thing that we realize, it is a skills-based practice. Most people don't know about the different tools and techniques that they can use to make journaling a practice that really supports their mental health and well-being. And Marie, we're not talking about necessarily about somebody who's had a diagnosis or a mental health diagnosis, because I think when we use the word, I think there's a lot of stigma around the word mental health.
Yeah.
And for me as a coach, for example, after COVID, for 4 years, I worked on a on-demand coaching service for GPs and GP partners and practice managers. And so much of the content of the coaching was around GPs' mental health and well-being. If your GP is not healthy, the quality of the service you're going to get is going to be impacted around their own mental health and well-being. So we need everybody in society to be as well as they can be. And what I realized from my own upbringing, from the trauma in my own background, was that the journaling enabled me to show up and to function in life in a better way than I think I would have had I not had this as a tool.
Yeah.
And one of, our mission is to really help people to embrace this as a practice, as a self-development tool that hosts just numerous psychological, physical, mental, creative benefits, but is also a tool that, I think has really benefited, for example, my thought leadership. My journal is where I come up with ideas. My journal is where I connect across different disciplines through my observations, through writing about what I've done today or talking about something that I've listened to. By capturing the nuances of my day, I'm not just allowing my day to happen to me,
Yeah.
and I think this is where what we're in danger of. We're in danger of not that lack of introspection. That famous quote, I think it was Elaine Lin talked about, we have to be able to introspect, we have to be able to understand what has happened in our day. So we're not just kind of going through the motions. And I think so many of us are up against this sort of like we're just sort of like on a tidal wave. We're like literally just we're just being swept away by life. And I can see the difference between when we step back and we stop and we pause and we think about who we are being. We think about how we're showing up. We're thinking about the conversations or the interactions that we have with people. And we're thinking about, what did I do well there? What could I have done differently? It makes for better quality relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. So f- there's so much to digest and there's so much to think about. And I'm very inspired to use my journaling practice on a more regular basis because as you were discussing and talking about the way you've journaled, the experience of your journaling, I'm reflecting also on the way I use my journal
Mm.
and probably not in some of the ways you've highlighted some of the practices that you've used to be more creative, to start to understand self a bit more or the way you are, or just as a human being, just connecting with your own humanity.
Yeah.
I found that quite inspiring. And some of the work that we can do, yes, you were saying that journaling isn't the replacement of any therapy that's required or coaching that's required. But some of the work that we can do, we can bring all of what we're journaling or what we choose to these other spaces to
Yeah.
help us to grow a lot more. So
Yeah.
I know that we could go on for, we've got so much to talk about in this space. And I think there's going to be a lot more in another conversation with yourself. But for our listeners today who probably say, oh, I can't journal, what
Yeah.
are the simplest ways that you can, tell them to begin?
Yeah. Well, simple looks different to different people, but here are some, and that's the thing I really want people to take away. There are so many different ways to journal. So on our Tuesday morning women writers writing space that we curate together, myself and Fiona, we always have a grounding right at the beginning. So the first thing is we always invite people to breathe, to pause. And that almost is like the first entry point to the journal, because most of us are sort of like hyperventilating our way through our day. And I think the moment you go offline, and, we'll talk another day about, my views around handwriting versus, doing an online journal, although the online journal world is becoming very generative. There's a Day One app, which I am a member of, and I love it. It's got so many different ways in which you can journal online, but there is something about writing by hand that really takes us into that analog space. And I think that because we are so overwhelmed by being on our screens so much longer than we need to be, by social media, by the virtual world. I think this can be a really good way of, first of all, just arriving in that space of having your notebook close to you, having a pen, and it doesn't matter what size of notebook you have. This is my current notebook, which I absolutely love. I love the cover. That inspires me, just having this nice cover. I particularly like notebooks that I can bend. I'm somebody who walks. I need to be able to have something that isn't rigid. And this is easy to take around with me. And the reason I'm being, quite pragmatic about this is you do need to have a notebook close to you. Like the way we carry our phones. My mission is to get everyone carrying a notebook. So you never know in your day where you get a moment that you can stop and pause. Yeah. And then we're a big believer at the School of Journaling in prompts. And prompts are what we think gets you really going. And the idea of a prompt is to stimulate you to write. So the idea is that you don't have to stay with the prompt, but the prompt is a way of getting you onto the page. So here are some examples. You might come to the end of your day and think, okay, I'm going to spend 7 minutes writing in my journal. Or you might start at the beginning of the day. I tend to do my journal at the beginning of the day. So you can start with what's gone well today. That means you're scanning your day. You've had a difficult day, but boom, you remember a conversation with a colleague where they made you laugh, or you made them smile, or it was a warm, intimate conversation, or you learnt something. So in amongst everything else that's happened, there's one thing or there's two things that's gone well. Now, starting there is a really good place, because what happens is that most people find, Marie, that there's not just one thing that's gone well. There's two things, there's three things, there's four things. But not making the time to examine it, like Socrates says, the unexamined life is not worth living. We would miss all of those things and we would forget about them. Yeah. So that's the first thing. And there's a load of research around. You can look at the work of Dr. Laura King. You can look at the work of Professor Robert Emmons around gratitude. We know that when you write about the good stuff, that also has a positive impact on your physical, emotional, and physiological and psychological well-being. Yeah. So you're not just doing a nice fluffy thing. Then you might think about what's troubled me today. You might think about, where in my day did I feel tense or anxious, or did I have a little bit of an unsettled feeling in my stomach? My stomach is often where I kind of feel a little bit of kind of unsettling, or my back might ache somewhere in a conversation or in a meeting. Start to notice what troubled you. And then you might write about that in a journaling technique we call a captured moment. It's where you take a snapshot of a moment from your day and you write about it in some detail. You might write about a difficult conversation that you were having with somebody. What were you wearing? What were they wearing? Where were you sitting? How did it feel in your seat? How was your body? How was you kind of approaching the conversation? And as you start to go into the detail, you might start to notice things that you missed. The tone of your voice, the pace of your breathing. Often I will hear clients say things like, I knew this is what I wanted to say, but I didn't say it. But now they've got the opportunity to look back on that and think about, now, if I have another opportunity, this is what I'm going to do differently. I am going to take 3 deep breaths before I start that conversation. Or I'm going to think about where I'm sitting and are my feet firmly on the ground. So you're doing that kind of work for yourself in a way that doesn't take a lot of time. Or you might do a list or a word cloud of words that just describes your day. What are all the words that you think when you think back on your day or your week? What are the kind of words that come to you? They don't have to make any sense to you. You know, we were talking about our weekend before we started this call, and we both went out dancing and we were both tired, but we still went out dancing and we felt energized. So I might have tired on there and I might have energized. I might be thinking about my week ahead. You know, I'm going off to work on a retreat after this, and I might be feeling overwhelmed, like I've got to get myself to wherever I've got to go to. But I'm also really looking forward to landing in that space with that group, but also meeting my colleagues. Yes, you talk about the words that describe your week, and then from there you pick out the things that are important to you. You use the reflection right. What are you noticing? What are you aware of? What surprised you? And Marie, I would really encourage everybody to have this is my colored pen, my pen with different colors on. But you know, I find writing in my journal with different colored inks, that's like a game changer. Because most of the time we're used to looking at black and blue ink on the page, and that there's a really strong association with work. I like to go into my journal and write in green or write in pink or write in mauve. I've got all these different coloured pens that I get from the pound shop. I have to express it the pound shop. And I find that it really helps me with a reflection piece. Or it really helps me to write about. So if I'm writing about something that is sort of like a generative idea, something that's creative, I might write that in a really bright, bold color. So it stands out in my journal. So I know when I go to a page and there's something in green ink, that's something I want to explore more. I want to play more with it, or it's an idea that I want to put into practice. So now your listeners they are taking ownership of what they're focusing on and where they're putting their energy, where they're putting their attention. And this can really give us a sense of purpose and direction. You know, I could have a really difficult day, and I do have them, but yet my journal will remind me of the stuff that's good. But it's also a place where I can also express the more challenging pieces, but it's almost like it gives me an equilibrium. I don't just err on the side of just one and ignore the other. And so I think that's a really those are some prompts that can get people started, and they don't take long. You could give yourself 5 minutes to do any one of those prompts. You could give yourself 3 minutes to do the reflection right. Yeah. But one of the things I will often do, so when I finish this notebook or journal, call it, you know, just name it what feels right for you. I often leave a couple of pages at the back, and I will sort of sift through my journal when I finished it, and I'll write down what are some of the themes
Yeah.
that have been present in this journal. I find that really helpful because it also makes me kind of very connected to where I've been. I tend to complete a journal a month when I'm writing. I don't always write every day. So I remember right at the beginning you said you have sporadic journaling. I no longer advocate that people have to journal every day. I think, you know, trust yourself when it's meaningful, when it's purposeful. But I personally have found the more I journal, the better I am in my day. That personally is something that I have noticed for myself. It grounds me, it centers me. I love having that feeling that I am thinking more and feeling more about the world around me, how I'm showing up in the world, what it's like working with my clients. I learn so much from my clients, what it is like in my everyday interactions with people. You know, I just find that this is a really rich space for me. And so many of my journals, you know, you mentioned at the beginning that I write a column, a monthly column every week in Psychology's magazine. Most of my columns have come out of my journal entries. I'll sit here. So I have a book called a common purpose book, which is slightly different to my journal. That's where I kind of share a lot. I write around my creative ideas for my work, like a course I want to write, or a quote that I might put a quote in there that I think will be useful for a workshop that I'm delivering. I start to map out ideas in there. And I will often have a list running of different topics that I will write about each month. And I can think about, I literally have this ability to think, oh, my journal that I wrote last year, I think it's that green one over there, that's got some notes about writing about nature or attachment styles or, whatever theme it is. So this way, my journal feeds into my thought leadership. My common purpose book is where I expand out those ideas. And that's another tool that I would like to recommend to your listeners, is that they have a book or a notebook where they start to map out their ideas. I just feel like we're flooded with information on social media. How many of us actually remember all of the things that kind of come in front of us?
Mm.
I can't even remember the last two podcasts that I've listened to.
Yeah.
If I don't write it down or I don't make a note of it. I was like, who said that really good quote again? What podcast was it? We're not making sense and meaning of it. So for me, my notebooks, my journals anchor something really valuable for me in terms of how I'm showing up. And I can see how this has made a difference to my clients. I have been doing some peer supervision with somebody that I trained with as a coach supervisor in 2012. We're still doing peer supervision together. And he sent me an email a couple of weeks ago, and he said, Jackee, after our last supervision session, you guess what? My notebook never leaves my side.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you.
And I can see the difference that that has made to him and his practice. And he also said to me, I'm now writing a book. And I know that it's come out of the reflective practice
Yeah.
and the difference that that's made for him.
Thank you, Jackee. Thank you so much for sharing your amazing knowledge around journaling and the importance of journaling, and how, as you were just saying, how a book can even come out of the journaling that you do. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Oh, it's been great talking to you, Marie. Thank you so much for making this time.
Thank you.